Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my Destiny Thoughts series. I'm Phantom139, and if you're new here, welcome. If not, then welcome back. This video is not associated with my State of Destiny 2 series that I have going on, but it's going to kind of follow a very similar format to those. This is going to be a topic discussion video today. So I did one of these last year when we had the whole fiasco with the corridors of time. This year, unfortunately, I have to do a new one, and I'm noticing a very unfortunate trend with the game where we have a good expansion experience followed by a lackluster season, and then a very terrible system or design decision causing the entire community to riot. So, as I mentioned, last year we had Corridors of Time be the big blunder. This year it's sunsetting, folks. Now, I know there are quite a few people out there who have already shared thoughts on the topic, some for sunsetting, some against. And I will say right away that there are counter arguments to be made for both sides. But today I kind of want to share my thoughts on why I feel like the concept was maybe flawed from a design perspective, and the execution of it just made it go down so much worse than it should have, and why the system as it was designed is not going to work for the game, but had it been tuned differently, probably would have worked out just fine. So, first and foremost, I do want to talk about what actually happened, or what is sunsetting for people who don't know what this is. So, for those who are unaware, Bungie announced last spring that starting with Beyond Light, gear would be set to have a maximum power level, at which point the items would no longer be allowed to infuse above a certain power level. These items would then be considered sunset from the game, having a kind of transparent icon that flipped the color palette on it, and the item then only existing as kind of a relic of the past for collection purposes, or to be used in non-power enabled content in the game. The first problem with this system is the execution of the system's targeted 8 seasons worth of items at once. So we effectively eliminated about 80% of the game's gear from usability, and I define usability in the sense as any item that can be infused beyond the infusion cap. And this is because nobody wants to equip items that will lower their power level, even if they are in a non-power enabled activity. Now, this has nothing to do with gameplay, but it's really just how players approach a stat-oriented game. Players will always prefer items with higher numbers. That's just the way it works, Bungie. The second problem is the system effectively eliminated all but one destination in the game from granting rewards that would be considered, by my definition, usable. Now, yes, I'm aware that we are reissuing 4 weapons from the Moon and Dreaming City. We'll talk about this problem in detail a bit more shortly. Now, the third problem with this sunsetting system is that players turning away from the critical game system of collecting and perk roll hunting because items now have an expiration date, so they don't really feel the need to actually go and grind for items anymore. And masterworking, which was supposed to be a investment back on the item, players don't really engage with this system anymore because if the game is putting an expiration date on an item, why would I spend the time to invest on an item that I'm not going to be able to use 12 months down the line? So the time investment versus the time in which players keep collected items is now becoming a problem that players are balancing, and it's really something that we shouldn't have had to do in the first place. So the net result is a lowering of player engagement and retention, and an acceleration of the content drought due to the loss of usable rewards being issued from all but the one destination being introduced in the newest expansion. I mentioned this problem in my State of Destiny 2 videos. In fact, I was actually mentioning this problem all the way back last spring when sunsetting was announced, and I have been continuing to actually beat this hammer down on the point here. So that kind of introduces the key problems with sunsetting, or actually just saying what this whole thing is that's been going on with the game. But now I actually want to break it down a little further so everyone kind of understands what's happening here, or why Bungie actually proposed this system in the first place, and the problems that are being introduced by the arguments that we're used to actually introduce this system in the first place. So first and foremost, we're going to go back to the Sunsetting blog and actually look at some of the points that Luke Smith put on the website as to why Bungie had to do this. And I'm going to break down each of these points and show everyone here, and Bungie in particular, why this really wasn't the way to do it. So first and foremost, let's actually talk about their first key point here. And Bungie mentioned this point as being legendary weapons undergoing what was called an infinite power creep problem, stating that the rewards team needed to spend so much more time to test and support old items instead of making new items, and that this reduced the player desire for new items, and at that point gear became nothing more than a checklist. So first and foremost, let's actually say what is power creep. Now, the definition of power creep in this sense is that if there is always a really powerful top tier item that in order to actually make something else that players want to use, the next thing will have to be even more powerful than that, and so on and so forth. And it just kind of creates this looping feedback process in which the only way gear becomes more interesting is if it is better and better. Now, first and foremost, Bungie needs to understand that Destiny never has had a power creep problem by this definition. The primary form of this power creep has been in the game since vanilla D2, and what I'm talking about here is the Outlaw Rampage perk combination. We had this combination since the game launched. There were a few weapons that actually had this combination, and while they were top tier choices, they weren't really the only choices that players used. Additionally, the power creep problem was introduced as part of pinnacle weapons, which were weapons that were set to be at a higher tier of power by the very definition of what they were made to be. Now, in regards to armor, players only ever hunted stat rolls. Perks have pretty much at this point been completely enveloped into armor mods, and therefore the power creep argument for this sake is null and void. There is no such thing as armor power creep. The second point that was made on the team needing to spend all this extra time to test every old weapon in the game is malarkey, folks. A game where weapons are defined by archetypes. Now, what do I mean by that? How many hand cannons are in the game? How many of them are 120 RPMs? Did you know that pretty much every 120 RPM hand cannon does the same thing? The only difference is their perks. So the whole power creep problem and needing to test all of these old guns, as Bungie said they had to do, is just defined by the perk combinations on the gear, nothing more. Now, the player's desire for new gear is fueled primarily by how effective the item performs in specific encounters. This is common sense. Set perk rolls that were most effective on weapons, again, Outlaw and Rampage, created the problem of what is actually an artificial power creep. The issue here is that Bungie refused to invest time to expand the perk pool and phase out the high-powered perk combinations, Outlaw, Rampage again, basically created this infinite feedback loop that moved the game to a critical point of nobody wants to get these new guns because they're using these old guns. Well, the problem is, since all of these old guns rolled with the same high-powered perk combination, and it was set in stone there in the first place, there really wasn't anything else that people wanted to actually go and get. Additionally, how the infusion system worked fueled the nature of Shard on Fine. Players will always choose to bump up their best items immediately. And unfortunately for Bungie, since they never addressed the old perk combination, that players just decided we're just going to keep using the same stuff over and over again. Now, Bungie also mentioned in the blog that players would just drop blues immediately, and this is just really how item rarity existed in Destiny 2. Blue items have historically never been better than legendaries, and to be honest, the only thing that's really going to change that, Bungie, is a design paradigm shift. But that is a topic for a different video. So that kind of hits the point of the first issue with Bungie saying that there was a power creep problem. Well, the reality is the power creep problem was created by perk combinations, and instead of actually spending the time in adjusting these really high powered perks or introducing new ones to replace them, they decided instead to wipe the entire slate clean. Next up, Bungie went on to say that the problems are not value, stating that the time could be pushed away from old gear and used instead to make new gear or improve old stuff. Now, Bungie, we've already seen what happens when you say you're making new stuff. And let's just say that Beyond Light loot pool was sad at best. We've already seen what making new stuff looks like. It's downright lie, Bungie. If this was true, the expansion would have had almost triple the amount of new items we got, or each archetype of weapon would have been replaced with a new item with each major release. Nothing old got improved either. Your definition of improving old stuff is to reissue it. And basically tell the player that, well, we're bringing back your old favorites, but you have to go grind for it again and get the exact same old roll, and then it's going to go away in 12 months. This is just creating this very sour feeling in the game's looting system. And a game that is designed to be a looter should be a lot more respecting of players' time and investment into their gear. So the third issue that Bungie brought up is that the original game has a lot of powerful, unique, rare items because the design of the game allowed them to be different. Bungie, that's called the whole point of the looter genre. There's supposed to be a power pyramid in which items collected get better, but more limited as you climb, but in turn, help you to reach higher points on the pyramid. Now, for the most part, Destiny accomplishes it not through the power of the weapons, but the item level of the gear, acting as a gating mechanism to specific activities. There aren't really any difficulty levels the game has that requires build synergy or specific items to be good. The statistical outliers are just good everywhere because there's nowhere in the game that absolutely requires these items. The only activity that actually needs specific builds are Grandmaster Nightfalls. Everything else is monotonous enough such that different loadouts are not necessary beyond the top tier items. The reason players chose the quote-unquote infamous Fatebringer Blackhammer Gallahorn combination in Destiny 1 was because each of these items carried a powerful, unique aspect that no other item in the game had, and it synergized perfectly in almost every encounter because of the nature of the design of the encounters and how the game's combat system worked then. To this date, this same combat system has remained in place. Addressing the problem of metas at this point requires a much deeper dive into the combat design philosophy. To just kind of extend this line of thought, let's turn back the clocks to a nerf that happened in Season 9, which was the sniper rifle damage nerf. So they took away that 20% damage to bosses. And Bungie's response was, snipers are too safe, and players aren't engaging in close range combat. So we're going to take away your sniper damage. Well, Bungie, have you ever considered that players aren't engaging in close range combat due to every boss having a slam mechanic that instantly kills players or does a huge amount of damage to them and then physics them into the wall to finish them, or simply cannot be engaged in close range combat? That is a problem of your combat design system, not a weapon. Your refusal to acknowledge the flaws of this combat design system, especially for boss encounters, fuels the development of what people are calling the metas. Basically fuels the drive of players to only use specific items because they're just the best to use. And the big problem is, since a majority of the game is on the exact same combat system and no activity requires anything different, the meta becomes useful everywhere, and therefore players only choose to use a limited number of items, ergo the top tier items. This is a problem that you're going to have to take a much deeper dive into to actually look down and say, how do we fix the combat system such that players are more inclined to actually branch out and use different types of weapons? That is going to be how you fix the problem of the infinite metas. Now, the fourth problem that Bungie mentions is that they cannot imagine a place in which this system exists in Destiny 2. They say that the items that originate from pinnacle activities don't have space to breathe. They also say that the old game made items obsolete with time. So, first and foremost, Bungie, the comment that you say players are always saying just make them better is not what the community has ever been asking for. The argument that has been pushed forth by the community is make items useful, not better. Now, the reason players brush aside a huge portion of the game's arsenal is because the items they collect just simply cannot perform in in-game activities. Let's take an example. Last Wish weapons. Outside of the curated weapon rules, the items were, for the most part, useless in the raid. They just couldn't compete with other gear in the game that had much better usability. Now, I personally attribute this to the team being too afraid to branch out in their perk design, or even weapon perk systems. This problem could very easily be solved by reintroducing raid-specific perks that only exist on the raid items, but at the same time only function inside the raid. Now, Bungie kind of took a little bit of a shot at this with the Deepstone Crypt, but I really think that they need to go that extra leg up here and actually make perks that improve weapon performance inside the activity that they originate from, and then make it only useful in that activity. But we'll talk more about how we'll fix everything in a bit. Now, armor kind of exists mainly as a stat sheet. We mentioned this earlier. Players will always chase the stat rolls they desire. They want to spec into a certain stat, and they're going to find pieces that push that up the highest. The changes to the mod system in Shadowkeep, while a great addition to the game, kind of subsequently dealt a death blow to ever having armor be able to branch out again, because every armor piece can now use everything. The only exception being raid armor, which has a raid mod slot. The only issue with the raid mods is that Bungie is too scared to make the mods useful or make them worth using. So instead, players just use raid gear as just another piece of armor and use the same mods that everyone else is using. Sound familiar, Bungie? Yep, we have the same perk problem as weapons, only you're doing it with your raid mods too. Finally, the whole point that the old games made items obsolete with time, Bungie. Age of Triumph says hello, along with the infusion system that I remind you, you introduced into the game. Because, oh, that's right. The players already gave you a distaste of sunsetting back in Destiny 1. So please, Bungie, don't even bother with that one. The next thing that Bungie mentions is that weapons and perks that are shelved could be reissued at a further date, or involving the community to do so in fun ways. First, Bungie, the problem with reissuing existing items is that previously existing items cannot be bumped up to the new cap, already invalidating the argument that you made that we're going to respect a player's time and investment. If someone has already invested a lot of time into a piece of gear that is now being reissued, and you're not letting them bring that old piece up, even though the same piece is in the game, that is a major issue. Second, Bungie, there has yet to be a single retired perk thus far. The only thing you've done so far is knocked out weapons, and again, about 80% of them. Reissued items, for the most part, still retain the original top-tier god rolls that players hunted for previously. Ergo, the whole Outlaw Rampage things, they're still out there. You haven't done anything about that. Third, the game's masterwork system, which was introduced to allow players to further invest in items that they like to use. Well, the thing is, Bungie, this system now becomes completely irrelevant other than moving up a stat and having a time-limited kill counter. Now, given the vast amount of materials to use the system, the investment requirement to use and actually enjoy the masterworking system no longer exists in the game. And therefore, it will kind of become completely irrelevant as time goes by. Players will eventually just drop it altogether. the last point that Bungie says is that exotics aren't being sunset now, but it is being considered. Bungie, let's just say this is how you kill your franchise, so don't even bother with that one. So that kind of goes over the whole list of big issues with sunsetting and the key points that Bungie mentioned as well, this is what's wrong with the game and this is why sunsetting needs to happen. Well, again, that's great and all, except that all of your arguments are wrong, Bungie. So let's actually turn the page here and let's talk about what I personally feel like needs to happen to actually solve the big issues in the game, like the actual problems. Bungie kind of employing the wrong tool to solve a problem. If the quote unquote gear creep problem is a screw, Bungie is trying to solve the problem by smashing the screw down with a hammer instead of taking a screwdriver to it and fixing it slowly and in the right way. So let's turn back the clocks, or imagine an alternate reality where Bungie actually considered the problems from the perspective of the looter genre instead of saying it was a magic card game. I'm gonna be honest, Bungie, at this point it would much just be better for you to just come out and admit you're wrong and cancel the system as a whole. It's hurting the game in a negative manner, and no amount of changes to how the gear removes and then reissues the items will satisfy the players. Even though most players have deleted their old gear, being able to at least hunt for those rolls again and re-adding a large amount of the gear back to the game will fix a huge amount of your lack of content problem right now. And I'm just going to be honest right now. I usually don't hit other content creators. I'm not going to drop names here, but there was a recent popular video. I'm just going to say that again, not going to mention who. And it was mentioned in said video that sunsetting was too baked into the game to be removed. Now, as a former independent game developer, let me just say that no system is ever too baked into a game. Sunsetting can easily be removed to allow for a better solution to be designed and introduced in time. Don't believe me? Well, let's turn back the clocks to vanilla Destiny 2 and then look at the Forsaken expansion. Does the words double primaries mean anything to you? Yeah, the whole weapon slot redesign, that was a major game system. And guess what? It got changed in less than a year. Radical system changes has already been done in Destiny before. So don't even bother with the whole it's too baked into the game argument. Nothing is too baked into the game. It can easily be taken out. But again, I'm not here to just slap down Bungie or content creators. Bad system, you're wrong, this is why. Those kind of videos do nothing to help the problem. Instead, I actually want to talk about the problems that Bungie mentioned and introduced a better alternative to the sunsetting issue, or actually just a new system to fix this problem that solves the real problems. So first and foremost, let's talk about the problem of players not using new gear. So as I mentioned, players will always prefer to choose items that perform best in each encounter. Now, solving that problem will require a better approach to both the introduction of new gear and how old gear moves up with time. The first thing that needs to happen is a change to the gear's infusion system. Now, what do I mean by that? Right now, all you need to do to infuse an old item up is find a new item that matches the same type and get an upgrade module. Boom, you're done. But what would happen if your old items actually needed to go through a little bit of an upgrade process instead? So what I'm considering here is, let's say instead we introduce a mini quest-like system to bump up items. So let's take an example. Let's say I want to bring up my Tranquility sniper rifle from Shadowkeep. Well, the game would see that this item was from one previous expansion, so one year ago. So what would happen is it would flag this as a one-step upgrade process. Now, let's say I wanted to do something from Forsaken. Well, that's 2 expansions ago, and now you have a 2-step process. What I would do is I would take the infusion node and replace it with a list of objectives based on how old the item is. These objectives are to use a current item of the same type. So again, we take the sniper rifle example, in order to infuse up the old sniper rifle, I would need to go get a new sniper rifle currently in the game and then get a bunch of kills with that or complete some objectives. Now, once I complete those objectives, I would get a seasonal infusion token that is locked to the current season's power cap on that item. I can then infuse my old gear up to the current season's cap from which the seasonal infusion token is from. And again, you would just go to the same old system of you need to find a matching item, you need to get an upgrade module, but the point being here is that you need to make it take longer to actually bring these items up. Now, for the seasonal items themselves, I would do a set number of objectives for each season away, but I would cap it to limit it like 3 or 5 at most, so it doesn't become too excessively hard to use the system. So this immediately fixes one part of the problem, where you actually introduce a new engagement loop where players can use their old items, but in order to do so, they actually have to engage with the new gear first. So this actually gets players to actually branch out and use new items right away. But that doesn't fix the problem completely. Now we need to actually solve the problem of why new items are never really held by players for long, or to say to actually make them usable. So what I would do next is I would make all the new gear and armor always have set special perks or mods specific to the seasonal or expansion activity from which they originate from. And these perks would make those items perform better in the activity from which they originate. So, for example, you would create raid perks and raid mods that go into the weapons and armor that make them perform better in that raid. For the seasonal activity, you would do the exact same thing. So, take an example of the current season of the hunt. You would make perks that you could put on the season of the hunt weapons or the armor from season of the hunt that increases your performance in Wrathborn hunts. Or perhaps you could make like a special mod that makes it so you get your lure charges faster when you're using that armor. Basically, the point being is you actually make things more useful in certain activities, so there's actually a reason to branch out. Additionally, I would consider for armor introducing gear set bonuses. So players actually branch out into whole sets of gear such that they get perk and stat bonuses to actually hunt down better rolls and actually want to go out and get full sets of gear. These two changes would go hand in hand. So again, talking about the changes to the infusion system and the new perks and armor mods. And it would encourage players to engage with new gear from the new activity and then be rewarded with items that are both fun to use and more powerful in said activities, while also retaining the ability to bring out their old favorites, bumping them up at the time, while also likely finding new favorites at the same time. The next problem we need to talk about is the power pyramid problem that I mentioned. The only weapons that ever really caused any major problems in the game were the pinnacle weapons. So these were your Una's Howl, Not Forgotten, Recluse, Mountaintop. Basically those top tier guns that were so much better than every other legendary of the weapons. These were outliers because Bungie simply made them to be outliers. And honestly, this the better place to introduce the whole concept of sunsetting perks, with the pinnacle weapon perks that were being too strong, sunset and replaced with a more standardized perk. Personally, I feel like having these powerful ritual or pinnacle weapons in the game, perfectly fine. But they should be limited in the end game with time. So this would be kind of a pseudo sunsetting concept. Now, what my idea for these items are is to transform them into a new rarity in which I would call trophy legendary. So kind of how you have the masterwork border right now, I would give it its own unique like color border, like instead of the gold, make it like red or something. Now, what I would do with these is allow them to be infused up to the current season's power limit at all times. So they affect your player's overall power, but are dropped to the limited power level in activities that are blocked. So here's an example. Let's say we use Not Forgotten. Now, right now, Not Forgotten has a limit of 1050. Under this trophy legendary system, you can infuse it up to the current power cap of 1260 and still be able to use it in your standard patrol, crucible strikes, and so on and so forth. But as soon as you touch an activity that is blocked, and Bungie could define these blocked activities, the power limit becomes enforced on the item, and it behaves as a 1050 item inside the activity. So obviously this would require a little bit of work to actually enforce additional power checks on it, but that's that's really what I would say you need to do, because that actually removes the issue I talked about players not touching old items anymore because they don't look powerful anymore with lower numbers. The next problem I think Bungie needs to really hit is the game not having any specific difficulty outside of Grandmaster being the source of build requirements. Now, every combat engagement in Destiny has been monotonous in nature since the introduction of the title. Unlike games such as The Division, in which enemies have archetypes and behave differently, and even behaving more differently as you change the difficulty levels of the game, that game actually requires you to have different strategies and different loadouts and builds to approach, eliminate enemies, and actually complete objectives and missions. Combat is streamlined in Destiny, with every engagement having pretty much the same answer to the problem. This is why Grandmaster content is more engaging and interesting. Each enemy is lethal to the point where you need to consider their strengths and weaknesses, something that just doesn't exist in the main game. And I really feel like this is where Bungie needs to spend most of their time to fix the big problem here. They need to actually look at the combat mechanics and address the problems of the entire game feeling monotonous in nature. And I feel like this is where the introduction of a global difficulty system for standard activities such as patrol or missions, along with a deeper look at enemy behavior that counters a large portion of the game's arsenal, again, talking about the whole slam mechanics of every boss in the game such that nobody uses shotguns, swords, and fusion rifles in PvE, would actually fix a lot of problems here. So that's going to kind of do it for my thoughts on sunsetting, and this is definitely a big topic of controversy in the community right now, but a large amount of the player base has really come out in stark opposition to the system and Bungie's choices on execution of the reissue aspect of sunsetting. The continued silence on the behalf of Bungie to not engage with the community in regards to the topic, or even acknowledge that they made a mistake here, is once again Bungie's weakness. It's double primaries all over again. Round and round we go, folks. Bungie makes a major issue, community comes out and says it, Bungie never talks about it, and then comes out with a big blog later in the year saying we're wrong and we're going to change it. We need to get to the point much earlier, Bungie. You need to actually start talking with people before you make big changes like this in the future, especially when a lot of people were telling you from the get-go not to do this, myself included. The big takeaway I want from this video is that the current execution of the system only amplifies the content drought of the game. It is removing the ambition aspect of players to engage with the title and strips out the long-term pursuits of the game to actually hunt gear that is better. Targeted sunsetting of high-powered perks, introducing season activity-specific perks on items, gear sets, and a redesign of how items are infused up to make it worthwhile to engage with the new gear, and a redesign of the game's combat systems would solve many of the problems, if not all of them, that Bungie laid out in the original reveal of the sunsetting system. A longer-term analysis of the game's combat mechanics, again, this is where I mentioned maybe introducing global difficulty, would actually shift players away from the one meta for everything paradigm. And yes, there are other problems with the year system. I'm looking at you, Shardall Blues. But this is something that is not related to sunsetting, and I could spend another video on that. So that's really all I wanted to talk about today. If you supported sunsetting going into this video, I kind of hope you found these points to be a bit more enlightening about why everyone else in the community disagrees with you and why all of Bungie's points for bringing it out were flawed in the first place. I do hope that this feedback gets to the right places. This game is dropping off of the radar for many of my friends, and I will say compared to last year, engagement has tanked, and I'm really hoping that, Bungie changes course and gets things right sooner rather than later. Please share your own thoughts here if you have any of your own ideas how this could be better done or improved. And if you agree or if you don't agree, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. My next Destiny video will likely be in the middle of next month as originally planned, with final closing thoughts for Season 12 and initial Season 13 perspectives. And that's going to do it for me today. So thank you for watching, and I will see everyone next time.